In AD 59, Emperor Nero was accused not only of murdering his mother, Agrippina the Younger, but of sleeping with her. That single line, copied and recopied across centuries, is the cold edge of a rumour so sharp it still cuts. It appears in the corridors of Rome's memory like a dagger glinting beneath a cloak, sheathed in the works of men who shaped the empire's afterlife on parchment. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio. Whether it was ever true almost mattered less to them and to Rome than the power of the accusation itself. To say the emperor committed incest with his mother was to name a crime that violated family law, tradition and nature all at once. It transformed a princeps into a monster. Before we step deeper into this labyrinth, do two things. First, subscribe so you never miss the darkest, strangest corners of history we uncover here. Second, tell me where you're watching from. Are you listening from Karachi at midnight? From London with the city humming outside your window? From a quiet village where the past feels close? Drop your city in the comments. Let's map the road this story takes through the present. Now walk with me into Rome. Oil lamps spit and hiss along the walls of the Palatine. Bronze doors grind open. The air is warm with cedar smoke and perfume, with sweat and fear. Somewhere beyond these corridors, a boy who became emperor at 16 picks at a lyre string, hums a bar of verse, and wonders whether the city still loves him or whether it ever did. Somewhere else in the same maze of halls, a woman once exiled and then exalted, once niece and then wife of an emperor, sits amid a scatter of letters and seals. She is Agrippina, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, wife of Claudius, mother of Nero. She has been called Augusta, empress, regent, schemer, poisoner. Soon she will be called something darker, and after her death, something darker still. Rome lived on spectacle, but it was rumour that wrote its morals. In the Forum, in smoky taverns off the Subura, in marble dining rooms where senators feigned modesty and plotted with dessert wine on their breath, the city judged its rulers through stories. A legion wins a border war? Good. The general returns with a triumph? Excellent. An emperor's private life bears the stink of impropriety? That, the Romans believed, told you the truth, because power could be hidden by ceremony, but appetite always showed. To accuse a man of incest with his mother was to expose a soul that had eaten its own order. We have to be frank about sources. Our Rome is not their Rome. We peer through the glass they handed us. Tacitus, writing the annals under Trajan and Hadrian, loved moral contrast. He sharpened character into warning. Suetonius, archivist and gossip, gathered scandal the way a crow gathers bright things. Dio, centuries later, remodelled earlier histories into grand architecture with its own shadows. None of them claim they saw Nero and Agrippina in bed. They say Rome believed it or that some said it. They note how the pair dined together, travelled together, reclined together in ways that offended the Roman eye. For a people who measured virtue by public restraint, the sight of a mother sitting beside an emperor like a co-ruler, wearing honours, appearing on coinage, speaking with ambassadors, already scraped the nerves raw. Add politics, add succession, add the steady hum of Nero's resentments and Agrippina's will. Rumour found oxygen. But why AD 59? Because that is the year the story breaks into blood. Earlier, in AD 54, Claudius died, poisoned, wrote the historians, by mushrooms and by Agrippina's design. The boy Nero becomes emperor, and for a while the empire wears its new youth with odd pride. Coins pair their faces, son and mother, almost equal. Seneca and Burrus steer policy. Agrippina sits near the throne like a second conscience or a second will. The Senate watches with the fixed smile of men who feel a tremor in the floor. The tremor is fear. Fear of a woman in daylight. Rome could stomach powerful women so long as their power wore a veil. Livia had been praised for prudence because she let Augustus stand in the doorway alone. Agrippina wasn't made for doorways. She stepped into the room, she sat, she issued letters in the emperor's name. She dismissed men with a glance that weighed them like coins and found them light. That visibility provoked the city's reflex, sexualize what you cannot control. When a woman's authority felt unnatural, Rome said her appetites were unnatural too. If she could rule like a man, then she must have loved like a monster. So the gossip starts simply, too close. It escalates naturally, indecent. It hardens for the record, incest. And then, after Baiae, after the collapsible boat, after the assassins in the villa and the famous, maybe apocryphal cry, "Strike my womb." It carves itself into the emperor's epitaph. He killed his mother. He bedded her too. The first charge is matricide, visible, undeniable. The second is incest, invisible, unforgettable. They coil together like snakes. But hold a moment, because an introduction should not convict. Our work is not to pick a side, to announce guilt or innocence in the first breath, but to map the terrain of the accusation. Ask what incest meant to Rome and why it worked as a political weapon. Ask how a boy emperor and his iron-willed mother came to this edge. Ask whether a dynasty whose myths began with Aeneas and Venus could bear the humiliation of a palace that heard whispers of Oedipus. Understand the Roman horror. Incest wasn't merely private vice. It was cosmic disorder. The domus, the household, was a model of the state. Father as authority, mother as order, children as future. To invert the roles, to fuse them, was to burn the blueprint. The emperor's bed was a public object, however private its curtains. What happened, or was believed to happen, there reflected on the mos maiorum, the ancestral way, hence the particular venom of the line that Suetonius preserves in essence. He defiled his mother, not loved, not lay with, defiled. A verb that treats a woman as a sacred object violated, and a man as a priest turned blasphemer. But the knife cuts both directions, and that ambiguity is crucial. The same rumour that damns Nero also damns Agrippina. In one version she is the seductress who kept the emperor chained to the pillow. In another she is the fatal mother whose love curdled into control. In a third she is the weapon forged by her enemies, her intimacy construed as indecency, so that her power could be called perversion. Slander is efficient, one story, two bodies pierced. If you listen closely, you can hear politics snapping its fingers behind the tale. The Praetorian Guard, the freedmen's secretaries, the senatorial blocks, the rival mistresses, all had stakes in whether Nero obeyed his mother or severed her. Acte, low-born lover, Poppaea Sabina, the exquisite spur, Seneca, the tutor who preferred philosophy to the queen mother's command, Burrus, the hard man of the soldiers, each played their part in pushing an adolescent emperor to prove he was sovereign. What gesture could be more sovereign than to defy the woman who made him? And once he did, once the blood in AD 59 dried on a villa floor at Baiae, what story would justify that act to a city taught from cradle to grave to honour the mater familiars? You see how the lines converge. If she had conquered his bed, he was reclaiming his throne. But the story could be older, darker. Some Romans had already whispered of Caligula and his sisters, of public kisses that lasted too long, of nights that lasted until scandals turned to jokes and jokes turned to fear. Agrippina had been among those sisters. Rumour is a hereditary disease in dynasties. It treats blood as both vector and proof. If Caligula's palace had the smell of incest, perhaps Agrippina's boy would carry it too. That is how template becomes prophecy. Step out of the palace now and cross the city. In the Subura, where buildings lean toward each other like gossipers, a tavern keeper pours watered wine and says, "The emperor sings on stage like a woman." In the Forum, a lawyer says, "The mother is seen in a litter beside him." On the Capitoline, a priest says, "The omens are strange this season." And someone, no one knows who, says, "I heard what they do at night." That is how it starts. The city is a mouth that never shuts. And yet, to treat Nero only as the beast of a sex scandal is to flatten a complicated, tragic figure. He loved performance. He yearned for approval. He built as well as burned. He funded spectacles. He tried, according to himself, to be beloved as an artist and necessary as a ruler. The very tension between the boy who performs and the city that scorns him feeds the rumour, because Rome trained its rulers to be stone and its poets to be soft. A prince who sang could be called effeminate. A prince who took counsel from his mother could be called un-Roman. Put those together and you have a prince who could be called unnatural. From there the leap to incest is not as far as it should be. We must also be honest about memory. The accounts that survive were written after Nero fell, after AD 68, after his enemies had reason to settle scores in ink. It is easier to remember the emperor who slept with his mother than to remember the policies that bored audiences or the budgets that angered senators. A civilization as theatrical as Rome wants its villains properly costumed. Nero's costume is stitched from matricide and incest. He is all crimson and shadow, no linen at all. So here is the promise of this series. We will not excuse, we will not sensationalize without foundation. We will reconstruct how the accusation was born, why it spread, and what it meant to a people who measured cosmic order in family terms. We will put the rumour beside the coinage that shows Agrippina facing the emperor as an equal. We will set the private tales beside the public ceremonies where she was honoured as Augusta. We will examine the year AD 59 not just as a murder plot with a collapsible boat and a botched drowning, but as a climax of 5 years of shared rule and growing hatred. And we will end where Rome itself ended, with Nero, a suicide, a line qualis artifex pero, what an artist dies in me, and a city deciding how to write the epitaph. Tonight we open the door. Behind it is not only a bed and a rumour. There is a mother's ambition shaped by exile and bloodlines. There is a son's vanity sharpened by applause and anxiety. There is a senate that pays with flattery and collects in whispers. There is a people trained to think with myths and judge with morals. Incest is the story they told to make sense of a sight they could not bear. A woman too close to the throne. A boy too weak to stand alone. If you're still with me, good. History at this depth is not a sprint. It is a descent, layer by layer, until the rumour that seemed obvious grows strange again, and the monster that seemed simple grows human. We begin with AD 59 because that is where the rumour finds its thunder. But to hear the drum roll you must listen to the years before. AD 49, when an uncle married his niece to change the law. AD 50, when a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was adopted and became Nero. AD 54, when a plate of mushrooms was served and the empire exhaled into a new reign. Each step builds the stage. Each date is a plank underfoot. So breathe in and look again at that first line. In AD 59, Emperor Nero was accused not only of murdering his mother Agrippina, but of sleeping with her. It is both headline and verdict, both hook and warned. Over the next chapters we will ask, who sharpened it? Who swung it? Who bled? If you haven't already, subscribe. Not because algorithms like it, though they do, but because this is a journey told best in sequence. And tell me where you're watching from. I picture a map of the world pricked with tiny lights, a constellated audience, each of us holding a fragment of the past. The Romans would have envied that, a rumour travelling oceans in an instant. They would also have understood it too well. Now the lamps are low, the corridor ahead is dark, and the first figure we meet is a boy with a crown and a mother at his shoulder. In the autumn of AD 54, the Roman Empire awoke to a rumour that quickly hardened into fact. Emperor Claudius was dead. The details varied. Some whispered he choked on a mushroom, others that he drank a cup of poisoned gruel, but nearly every voice, from senator to street vendor, agreed on one point. The hand that guided the poison belonged to Agrippina the Younger. Whether or not she truly killed her husband, the timing was perfect. Claudius's heir, his son Britannicus, was still a teenager. Agrippina's own boy, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, newly renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, was just 16, and yet it was Nero, not Britannicus, who stepped forward to inherit the purple. The streets of Rome crackled with uncertainty. Imagine it, the clang of smiths in the forum, merchants hawking fish on the Tiber's banks, slaves running errands with baskets on their heads. Among them moved heralds crying the name of a boy emperor, Nero Caesar Augustus Germanicus, and in their minds the citizens turned the name over and over, tasting it, wondering if this fragile youth could hold the vast weight of empire. Nero was born in AD 37, the very year his uncle Caligula took the throne. His lineage was impeccable and dangerous. He was the great-grandson of Augustus, grandson of Germanicus, and nephew of Caligula. His blood carried the full tangled inheritance of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, nobility, instability, and the shadow of violence. By the time Claudius adopted him in AD 50, his path to power was already being carved by Agrippina's relentless hand. When Claudius died, the Senate moved quickly, urged on by Agrippina's persuasion and the Praetorian Guard's muscle. Within hours, Nero stood before the Senate in ceremonial toga, his youthful face pale under the wreath. His speech, crafted by his tutor Seneca, spoke not of conquest but of partnership. He promised to restore the Republic's dignity, to honour the Senate's authority, to rule as the servant of Rome's people. For a moment, the city believed him. The Senate, weary of Claudius's oddities and frightened of Britannicus's youth, sighed in relief. The Praetorians, rewarded with donatives, cheered, and the Roman people, dazzled by Nero's appearance — he was handsome with wide eyes, auburn blonde hair, and a statuesque profile — embraced their boy ruler. But no one doubted who truly pulled the strings. Behind Nero, at every ceremony, stood Agrippina. She was more than the mother of the emperor. She was his maker. Coins from these first years of Nero's reign tell the story in metal. Nero's head on one side, Agrippina's on the other, their profiles facing like co-rulers. It was unprecedented. Never before had the image of a woman, even an Augusta, shared such space with the emperor himself. For Romans, accustomed to female influence whispered behind curtains, this was shocking. Agrippina occupied the Palatine Palace like a general in command. She received foreign envoys. She signed imperial letters. She appeared in public seated beside her son, dressed in purple robes reserved for emperors. At festivals, her litter was borne by soldiers, as though she were an equal sovereign. Every gesture, every appearance was a performance that shouted, "I rule because I am his mother." And Nero, still a teenager, still playing at lyres and scribbling verses, seemed content at first to let her. It is here that the whisper of scandal begins. Roman society had little patience for powerful women. Livia, the wife of Augustus, had ruled subtly. She was remembered as prudent, discreet, but Agrippina's dominance was blatant, unashamed. Senators muttered that she crossed lines, to sit in council with men, to wear imperial purple, to appear on coinage. These were not the roles of a woman. How, then, did they explain her influence? The Roman imagination turned where it often did. Sex. The mother who guided her son's hand too closely was imagined as the mother who guided him into her bed. To those uneasy with Nero's youth and Agrippina's dominance, incest became the perfect metaphor for their partnership. Unnatural, corrupt, dangerous. In these early years, the rumours remained only murmurs, but they were fueled by Agrippina's history. She had already been accused of incest with her brother Caligula, a slander that clung to her name long after his assassination in AD 41. To whisper that she now seduced her own son was not a leap, but an echo of a pattern. Meanwhile, Nero tried to balance his boyish desires with the crown's demands. He adored the theatre, singing and poetry, pursuits Romans scorned as effeminate in a ruler. His tutor Seneca and the general Burrus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard, urged him to keep to public duty, to temper his excesses. But Agrippina, she wanted him to remain under her thumb, obedient, dependent. Conflict was inevitable. In AD 55, just months into his reign, Nero's relationship with his mother began to sour. He fell in love with Acte, a freed woman from Asia Minor, hardly suitable for an emperor. Agrippina raged. She reminded him that Britannicus, Claudius's true son, still lived, still had a claim. She hinted that if Nero strayed from her control, she could elevate another. For a boy just stepping into power, this was a knife at the throat. That same year, Britannicus died, poisoned during a banquet. Ancient historians claimed Nero ordered it, fearing his stepbrother's challenge. Agrippina, however, had no tears to shed for Claudius's child. With Britannicus gone, Nero's throne was secure, but the bond between mother and son began to unravel. The people of Rome, watching from the outside, saw only fragments. They saw a boy emperor making speeches crafted by others, seen always in the shadow of his formidable mother. They saw coins pairing her image with his. They saw her litter carried by guards, her robes flashing with imperial purple, and they whispered, "He is her puppet." But in private, Nero began to imagine freedom. He practiced singing with friends late into the night. He raced chariots in the gardens. He dreamed of living as an artist, not as a ruler. And he began to resent the iron grip of the woman who had put the diadem on his head. It was here, in the uneasy years between AD 54 and 59, that Rome's cruelest whisper found its roots. The boy who was emperor seemed too young, too pliant, too beautiful. The mother who ruled beside him seemed too visible, too ambitious, too unashamed. What else could explain it, the Romans asked, except the darkest sin of all? Nero was still a boy. Agrippina was still a mother. But in the imagination of Rome, their closeness was already corrupt. As Tacitus would later write in the Annals, Book 13, she was eager to keep him obedient to her, whether by authority or, if need be, by sin. Whether this was history or slander, the seed was planted, and it would grow, until in AD 59 it bore the most terrible fruit. But before we reach that year of murder and whispers, we must understand Agrippina herself, the woman who believed she was born to rule Rome. When the name Agrippina the Younger is spoken, it carries the weight of Rome's bloodline, the shimmer of ambition, and the stench of rumour. She was no ordinary noblewoman. She was a woman carved out of dynastic destiny and personal ruthlessness. Born in AD 15 at Oppidum, modern-day Cologne, Germany, she entered life in a military encampment on the Rhine frontier, daughter of the celebrated General Germanicus and the noblewoman Agrippina the Elder. Her childhood was not cloistered in softness, but forged in the thunder of armies and the spectacle of imperial triumphs. From birth her veins flowed with the power of Rome. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Her father Germanicus, beloved of the legions, had been marked as heir to Tiberius, and his death in AD 19, rumoured to be from poison, thrust Agrippina's family into the pit of Roman politics, where daggers flashed in the dark and loyalty was measured in whispers. Agrippina grew up watching her mother clash with Tiberius, seeing her brothers, including the infamous Caligula, humiliated, exiled or destroyed. These lessons scarred her but also steeled her. She learned what Rome did to women who stood too boldly, and what it did to families who fell from favour. She learned to survive not by shrinking but by mastering the very weapons of her enemies, appearances, alliances and the careful control of narrative. By the time she became empress, Agrippina already bore the marks of tragedy. She had been exiled under her brother Caligula in AD 39 for conspiracy. She had endured a failed first marriage, widowhood and political disgrace, but like a phoenix rising from ash, she returned when Claudius, her uncle, took the throne in AD 41. Within 8 years she would not only secure her return to Rome's centre, but also bind herself to the emperor through marriage, becoming both wife and niece, a union so shocking it required special legislation. Why would Claudius consent to such a union? He was older, awkward and often ridiculed for his limp and stammer. Agrippina was younger, striking and fiercely intelligent. Claudius needed legitimacy, stability and a connection to the Julian bloodline. Agrippina offered all three. In return, she gained the platform from which she could launch her son Lucius Domitius Hannibarbus, soon to be Nero, into imperial destiny. It is crucial to understand that in Rome, women were officially powerless. They could not hold magistracies, lead armies, or stand in the Senate. Yet Agrippina bent these limits until they cracked. She built networks of influence, alliances with freedmen like Pallas, loyalty from generals like Burrus, and the intellectual firepower of philosophers like Seneca, whom she arranged as Nero's tutor. She knew that to rule Rome she had to rule the men who ruled Rome, and she succeeded. When Claudius adopted Nero in AD 50, Agrippina celebrated a triumph of her own. Nero was named heir over Claudius's biological son, Britannicus, an extraordinary reversal that spoke to her persuasive grip over the emperor and his court. Coins soon bore her image alongside Claudius's, signalling her rise. Statues placed her at his side in public spaces. For the first time, Rome beheld not merely an empress but a woman positioned as a co-sovereign. This visibility was deliberate. Agrippina believed her authority must be seen to be believed. She appeared in processions, wearing the purple of the Caesars. She took her place in the Senate chamber, behind curtains but still present, a woman intruding upon the masculine heart of politics. Foreign kings and envoys paid her homage as if she herself sat on the throne. Her son Nero, still in adolescence, became both weapon and shield. She projected her power through him, while grooming him to embody the dynasty's glory. But such boldness carried costs. Rome was a city obsessed with morality, or at least the appearance of it. A matron was supposed to be modest, veiled, silent in public affairs. Agrippina shattered this mould. Her enemies began to whisper, if she was capable of defying the customs of women, what other boundaries might she cross? Was she a faithful wife to Claudius, or his ambitious puppet master? Was she a nurturing mother, or a seductress binding her son with unnatural affection? This is where the seeds of scandal sprouted. Agrippina's closeness to Nero became a spectacle. She was always by his side at public ceremonies, guiding his words, influencing his decrees. When he was crowned in AD 54, still only 16, it was her face that gleamed with triumph. Ancient sources like Tacitus and Suetonius record that Agrippina often entered his rooms without announcement, dined with him in ways that blurred boundaries, and at times reclined with him in manners deemed indecent for mother and son. Were these details true, or were they inventions of her enemies, male historians eager to explain her dominance through sexual scandal? It is impossible to know. What is certain is that Agrippina's power frightened Rome's elite, and incest rumours became the easiest blade to wield against her. Her reputation was also coloured by her family. She was the sister of Caligula, remembered for his depravity. Suetonius tells us Caligula was rumoured to have slept with all three of his sisters, Agrippina among them, using them as pawns in his political games. Whether this was true or not, the association lingered like a stain. When Agrippina now rose beside Nero, the echo of those earlier whispers returned. She had lain with her brother, now she lies with her son. The reality, though, may have been far more pragmatic. Agrippina was above all else a politician. She fought for survival in a dynasty that consumed its own. She manoeuvred to ensure Nero's rise because in his reign lay her own safety and her family's supremacy. Her scandalous proximity to Nero in public was likely calculated to reinforce her influence and signal her indispensability. To men who loathed female authority, however, politics in a woman's hands could only be explained as the work of lust. It is telling that Agrippina never softened her posture. She did not retreat, did not cloak her actions in modesty. Instead, she flaunted her position. When foreign embassies came, they addressed both Nero and Agrippina. When disputes arose, she intervened. In AD 55, after Nero began asserting independence, she threatened to champion Britannicus's claim instead. Such boldness was both her strength and her doom. Agrippina's power was a paradox. She wielded it in a world that denied her right to it, and so the more openly she ruled, the more monstrous she appeared to contemporaries. To the Senate, she was an interloper. To poets like Juvenal, she was a sexual deviant. To historians like Tacitus, she was a dangerous woman who blurred natural order. And yet, without her, Nero might never have worn the purple. Her hand steered his coronation, her allies secured his place, her image validated his reign. For 5 years, she was the empire's true regent, the woman behind the throne who made Rome tremble. But Rome, as always, had no place for a woman who held power too long. The very visibility that exalted Agrippina now condemned her. The incest whispers grew louder, feeding on her dominance. Every time she appeared in purple, every time she reclined beside her son in public, the rumour tightened its grip. Nero himself began to chafe, resenting the shadow she cast. And the bond between mother and son, once Rome's strongest alliance, began to twist into something darker: rivalry, suspicion, and the approach of betrayal. Agrippina's power was real, immense, and unprecedented. But in Rome's cruel imagination, it was inseparable from sin. To them, her authority could not be political. It had to be sexual. Maternal love turned unnatural. Whether true or not, the damage was irreversible. The mother who had raised an emperor would soon find herself painted as his lover, and ultimately as his victim. Rumour was the lifeblood of Rome. In a city where marble monuments towered above slums, where senators schemed behind cloaks and daggers, and where the mob's roar could crown or crush emperors, whispers travelled faster than legions. It was in this climate that the scandal of Nero and Agrippina took root, sprouting into one of antiquity's darkest legacies. By the middle of the 1st century AD, Rome was no stranger to gossip. The imperial court itself was both stage and audience for endless tales of debauchery, cruelty, and sin. The earlier Julio-Claudians had already left a trail of stories so grotesque they read like theatre. Augustus, though remembered for virtue, was accused of seducing senators' wives. Tiberius, retreating to Caprari, was whispered to have indulged in acts too vile to repeat. Caligula, Agrippina's own brother, was accused by Suetonius of bedding all 3 of his sisters, including her, in open defiance of morality. When Nero ascended in AD 54, crowned at only 16, Rome's appetite for whispers found a new feast. The boy emperor was young, malleable, and ruled in tandem with his mother. Agrippina, seated at his side, became too visible, too central. The Senate could not accept that a woman held such influence. The people could not believe it was purely political. Thus the first murmurs arose. Did she not already lie with her brother? Could she now be lying with her son? The historians who give us this story, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, were men writing with biases, steeped in senatorial disdain for imperial excess and suspicion of female power, yet their records shape the narrative for all time. Tacitus, in his Annals 13.5, records that Agrippina often shared Nero's bed and dined with him in ways that aroused suspicion. He suggests that their relationship blurred the boundaries of propriety. Suetonius Nero 28 goes further, bluntly stating that he defiled his mother. Cassius Dio, writing later, echoes the claim, noting how the emperor and his mother were seen in public together in postures beyond decency. But whispers were not born solely in the Senate or in history books. They arose from public theatre, from the streets, from the very fabric of Roman society, where scandal was currency. When Nero appeared in public, Agrippina was often at his side. She rode in the same carriage dressed in imperial purple reserved for emperors, reclined with him at banquets, and accepted foreign ambassadors alongside him. To conservative Romans, this was not the modest conduct of a mother, but the brazen intimacy of a lover. The gossip spread from the elite down to the plebs. At taverns near the Circus Maximus, over wine and bread, men muttered, "Have you seen the emperor's mother? She dines like a queen, she smiles like a bride." In the forums, graffiti scratched into stone walls may have carried jests and accusations, much as Pompeii's ruins later revealed crude jokes about sex and power. For the Roman mob, scandal was entertainment. For senators, it was ammunition. For historians, it became history itself. What fueled these rumours further was the Roman imagination itself. To the Roman mind, incest was not merely taboo. It was the ultimate symbol of corrupted power. It meant nature inverted, law broken, the family itself polluted. For the dynasty of Augustus, the first family of Rome to be accused of incest was to suggest the empire's very foundations were rotting. Thus, when enemies of Agrippina and Nero sought to attack them, incest became the sharpest dagger. Tacitus, writing between AD 109 to 120, composed his annals with a stern, moralizing tone. He despised the corruption of emperors, and Agrippina, bold and visible, became for him a symbol of ambition twisted into vice. In Book 13, he paints her as controlling Nero through seduction, describing her intrusions into his chambers and her jealousy over his lovers. To Tacitus, the idea of mother and son bound by unnatural lust was less about literal truth and more about political metaphor. Agrippina's dominance could only be explained in sexual terms. Suetonius, writing around AD 120, was less subtle. In the Lives of the Caesars, he delights in lurid anecdotes. His portrait of Nero is a catalogue of grotesque indulgences, murdering his mother, castrating and marrying the boy Sporus, performing on stage before commoners. Among these he inserts the claim, he defiled his mother. Suetonius does not argue, he asserts, presenting the incest rumour as fact to heighten Nero's monstrousness. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century AD, repeats the charges. Though further removed from the events, he draws from earlier sources and the centuries of gossip that had fossilized into tradition. His words reflect not only Nero's reputation, but also Rome's enduring need to portray its fallen emperors as monsters of both politics and flesh. Yet even as these historians recorded the whispers, they revealed their own discomfort. Tacitus hedges, often writing, "It was said," or rumour held, signalling that he himself could not verify such claims. Dio admits much of what was written came from hostile sources. Still, the damage was done. For once written, rumour becomes history. What is striking is how the whispers about Agrippina and Nero echoed earlier slanders. Her brother Caligula, as mentioned, was accused of incest with his sisters. Her predecessor Messalina, wife of Claudius, was accused of nightly prostitution in brothels. Agrippina inherited not just her bloodline, but also the weapon of rumour forged against imperial women. When power could not be tolerated, sexuality was corrupted into sin. By AD 55 to 58, these whispers reached fever pitch. Nero's growing independence and his liaisons with mistresses like Acte and Poppaea Sabina clashed with Agrippina's control. Public quarrels between mother and son became the stuff of gossip. Tacitus records that when Agrippina tried to assert herself, Nero accused her of attempting to seduce him, a son turning rumour against his own mother to undermine her authority. Imagine the cruelty. The same whispers that had made him appear weak under her sway now became his weapon to brand her as the seductress. Meanwhile, satirical poets and playwrights likely amplified the scandal. Juvenal, though later, immortalized Rome's obsession with women's lust in his satires. In these works, the monstrous mother became a stock figure, a woman whose ambition twisted into forbidden desire. Agrippina's image fit too neatly into this mould for rumour to ever fade. Thus the murmurs were never isolated. They formed a chorus, rising from the Senate, the streets, the stage, and the historian's scrolls, until they became Rome's truth. Even centuries later, medieval chroniclers embroidered the story further, imagining lurid details, pushing Agrippina into the realm of legend rather than history. The whispers had grown so large that they drowned out the reality of politics, governance, and strategy. Agrippina was not remembered for her reforms, her alliances, or her survival in a deadly dynasty, only for the bed she was said to share. And yet, behind every whisper lay the cold logic of political assassination. Incest rumours were not born because Rome cared about truth. They were born because they worked. By branding Agrippina and Nero as sinners against nature, their enemies made them irredeemable, stripping away sympathy and legitimizing their eventual downfall. By AD 59, as tensions between mother and son reached their breaking point, the murmurs no longer needed evidence. They had become Rome's common knowledge, etched into the city's memory like graffiti into stone. When Agrippina finally fell to Nero's assassins, no one was surprised. She had been doomed long before the blade touched her, condemned not just by her son's ambition but by the relentless whispers of Rome. The story of Rome's murmurs is thus a story of power and poison. It shows how words could kill as surely as daggers, how history could be twisted into scandal, and how a mother's political strength could be recast as sexual weakness. Agrippina the Younger, the empress who made an emperor, was immortalized not for her empire building, but for a whisper in a marble hall. She shared his bed. The Roman Empire was not ruled only in palaces or on battlefields. It was ruled in public gaze. Every appearance of an emperor, every word, gesture and garment became theatre, a spectacle designed to remind the people of power. And in this theatre, Agrippina the Younger played her role with a mastery that terrified the Senate, scandalized the people, and left historians with a portrait so shocking they could not resist framing it in the darkest of terms. When Nero became emperor in AD 54, the very act of his coronation revealed the extent of Agrippina's authority. He was a boy of just 16, trembling on the steps of power, while his mother, regal and ambitious, stood behind him like a guiding hand. Ancient sources, especially Tacitus, Annal 1325, freedmen, senators and envoys from distant provinces learned quickly that to reach Nero, one had first to pass through his mother. In Rome's eyes, this was unprecedented. Women had always influenced politics. Livia, wife of Augustus, had shaped succession with quiet grace. Antonia, mother of Claudius, had guided the family with dignity. But Agrippina did something different. She made her influence visible. She did not whisper from behind veils. She strode onto the stage itself, and that visibility transformed admiration into suspicion. The purple robe became one of her weapons. In Roman tradition, purple was the colour of emperors, a dye so expensive it was almost priceless. Extracted from the murex shellfish of Tyre, it signified absolute power. When Agrippina appeared wearing purple, she crossed a sacred line, a woman taking on the symbols of a man's authority. Tacitus tells us that she sat beside Nero, draped in garments that blurred the line between mother and co-ruler. For senators steeped in tradition, it was intolerable. To the mob, it was thrilling, yet disorienting. Was she Rome's queen, Rome's mother, or Rome's lover? At public banquets, she reclined with Nero, as Roman aristocrats reclined on couches during feasts. This act, harmless in itself, was transformed by context. To see mother and son sharing the same table, whispering together, drinking wine as equals, was to see boundaries dissolve. Tacitus notes the raised eyebrows, the muttered suspicions. What family dines like this? What emperor allows it? Soon, rumours hardened into scandal. If Agrippina sat at the emperor's side as his equal in public, what must she be in private? Even more shocking were the audiences with foreign envoys. Agrippina demanded to sit on a throne beside her son when delegations from distant kingdoms arrived. This was not merely a breach of etiquette, it was a declaration. Roman custom dictated that women remained in the background, their political roles invisible. By insisting on a throne, Agrippina announced to the world that she was co-sovereign. Cassius Dio, Roman History Book Lethengai, describes how she greeted envoys with such confidence that some addressed her as though she were the emperor herself. For the Senate, this was scandalous. For Agrippina's enemies, it was easy ammunition. A woman who ruled like an emperor must surely behave like one in every forbidden sense. The theatre of power extended to statues and coinage. For the first time in Roman history, coins were minted that showed mother and son together. Nero's youthful face appeared alongside Agrippina's, as though she were not only consort but co-ruler. The symbolism was unmistakable. Nero owed his crown to her, and he ruled with her. To some it was reassurance that a boy emperor had guidance. To others it was proof that Agrippina's ambition had no limits. Once more scandal followed, and there was the matter of the kiss. Suetonius Nero 28 records whispers that Nero kissed his mother too intimately in public, arousing suspicion of incest. To modern eyes this may seem like ordinary maternal affection, exaggerated by gossip. But in Rome, where propriety was a fragile mask, a kiss could be politicized into proof of sin. The theatre of power had no neutral gestures, every act became a performance for the mob. A mother's kiss was twisted into a lover's embrace. Agrippina understood the stage she was walking onto, but perhaps underestimated its dangers. She had grown up in a dynasty where scandal was weapon and armour alike. Her brother Caligula had flaunted his sisters as companions, even appearing with them in public like wives. Rumours of incest swirled, but Caligula embraced them, using shock to terrify the Senate into submission. Agrippina, raised in this furnace, may have believed visibility was strength, yet the Senate was not terrified, it was scandalized. The irony was that Agrippina's public displays were not in themselves unusual in other monarchies. In the Hellenistic kingdoms, queens often sat beside kings, even co-ruled. Cleopatra had once ruled Egypt with her brother, even her son. But Rome was different. The Republic had left behind a deep suspicion of kingship, and with it suspicion of women in power. To see a woman so close to the imperial throne was to see the Republic's old fears come alive again. The people whispered, "She is not a mother, she is a queen. She is not a queen, she is his wife." The historians amplified the stage. Tacitus portrays Agrippina as a woman who never left her son's side, whose presence at spectacles, ceremonies and dinners was itself indecent. Cassius Dio insists her ambition turned Rome's stomach. Suetonius, more salacious, links her public power directly to incestuous whispers, claiming that such boldness could only come from a relationship beyond maternal bounds. None of them paused to consider that Agrippina's presence was political necessity, that a boy of 16 could not rule alone. They did not see necessity, they saw theatre. And theatre demands interpretation. For the Romans, the sight of Agrippina dressed in purple, seated in thrones, minting coins with her image, and reclining with Nero at banquets demanded an explanation. And the explanation that stuck was the ugliest one: incest. In the Roman imagination, incest explained everything. Why Nero obeyed her, why she appeared as his equal, why senators deferred to her. Political dominance was recast as sexual corruption. By the late 50s AD, the whispers had become common currency. Agrippina's political enemies and Nero's lovers, especially Acte and later Poppaea Sabina, spread the idea that Agrippina was not merely mother but seductress. They fueled the belief that she used her body to control her son, that her power was carnal rather than political. In a society where sexual morality was bound to political legitimacy, this was fatal. A woman who ruled by ambition could be tolerated. A woman who ruled by incest could only be destroyed. The theatre of power that Agrippina built thus became the theatre of her downfall. Every purple robe, every shared banquet, every throne beside her son, every coin with her image, all became props in a story her enemies told, and the audience, Rome itself, believed it. When the historians set quill to parchment, they recorded not Agrippina's strategies, not her diplomacy, not her protection of Nero in his youth, but the scandal her visibility created. And so, for all of time, she has been remembered not as the architect of Nero's reign, but as the woman whose very presence turned into proof of an unholy bond. Rome was a city addicted to whispers. From the crowded streets of the Subura to the marble halls of the Palatine, rumours carried faster than official decrees. In this world, reputation was not a reflection of truth. It was truth. And when it came to Nero and Agrippina, the whispers that grew in the late 50s AD formed one of the darkest and most enduring scandals of antiquity, the charge of incest. The earliest seeds of this allegation are found in Tacitus' Annals, Book 13, Section 2, where he records that Agrippina's behaviour with Nero aroused suspicion of an incestuous relationship. Tacitus, ever cautious, frames it as rumour, something said, something believed, but he also makes clear that Rome believed it strongly enough to leave an indelible mark. Later writers like Suetonius, Nero 28, and Cassius Dio, Book 3228, repeat the story with fewer caveats. By their telling, Nero and his mother did not simply share a throne or purple garments, they shared a bed. Why did this particular accusation stick? To understand, we must remember the Rome Agrippina lived in. It was a city where moral order was tied to family order. Fathers controlled households with near absolute power. Mothers were meant to embody modesty and chastity. To suggest that a mother had slept with her son was not just a sexual charge. It was a crime against nature, a reversal of the sacred hierarchy that underpinned Roman society itself. It was, in Roman eyes, the ultimate taboo. The rumour gained traction because of how Agrippina behaved in public. She appeared beside Nero in purple robes, sharing thrones, sharing banquets. Suetonius claims she was seen reclining with him at feasts in a way no Roman matron should. In Roman banquets, the intimacy of reclining together on couches often implied conjugal status. So when mother and son did this before senators and foreign envoys, Rome's imagination leapt to the most scandalous interpretation. If they dined like spouses in public, what did they do in private? Tacitus sharpens the accusation in Annals 13:5 when he describes how Agrippina, fearing Nero would abandon her influence for his mistress Acte, did not scruple to threaten that she would reveal his shame. What was this shame? Some interpret it as the incest rumour itself. The suggestion is that Agrippina, in a moment of fury, threatened to expose their own forbidden intimacy, or at least to make the rumour public, weaponizing it against her son. Suetonius goes further. In his Life of Nero 28 he writes baldly, he defiled his mother. For Suetonius, writing decades later in the early 2nd century, the insinuation of Tacitus had hardened into fact. He repeats stories that Nero and Agrippina were caught in compromising positions, that they travelled in the same litter, their bodies too close, their gestures too affectionate. Cassius Dio, another century later, paints the same picture. Rome believed, or at least wanted to believe, that Nero was his mother's lover. This scandal was not born only from whispers. It was sharpened by Nero's other relationships. His early affair with the freedwoman Claudia Acte was a point of tension. Agrippina hated Acte, dismissing her as beneath imperial dignity. Tacitus describes Agrippina storming into Nero's chambers, insulting Acte, and warning Nero that his dalliances would humiliate them both. Some ancient writers claim Agrippina went further, that she offered her own body to keep his attention, to remind him of her power over him. Whether this was true or invented, it fueled the narrative. A mother competing with her son's lovers for influence could only be imagined as a seductress. Then came Poppaea Sabina, the ambitious woman who later became Nero's wife. Poppaea despised Agrippina and allegedly goaded Nero into severing ties with her. Hostile sources suggest Poppaea whispered that Agrippina's control was unnatural, that it could only be explained by incest. Here again, political rivalry took on a sexual mask. In Rome, women fought through slander, and slander most often wore the colours of lust. But perhaps the most damning evidence of how incest rumours were used lies in the Senate itself. Senators watching Agrippina sit beside her son in purple, searching for a language to express their horror, reached for the vocabulary of excess. To accuse a woman of sleeping with her son was to mark her not merely as ambitious but as monstrous. It was a shorthand for saying she had crossed every boundary, political, moral, natural. And this was not the first time Agrippina's family had faced such whispers. Her brother Caligula had been accused of sleeping with his sisters, including Agrippina herself. Suetonius Caligula 24 even claims he prostituted them at banquets, flaunting their intimacy before shocked guests. Whether these stories were true or not, they established a pattern. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was painted as incestuous, corrupt, decadent, beyond measure. Agrippina carried that stain with her, and when she became too powerful, it resurfaced in whispers that she had simply transferred the sin from her brother to her son. The power of these allegations lies not in their truth, but in their utility. For Nero's rivals, for Agrippina's enemies, incest explained everything. Why was she so close to him? Why did he defer to her? Why did she appear as co-ruler? The answer, whispered in the markets, repeated in the Senate, recorded by historians, was that their bond was not only political but sexual. Modern historians largely reject the incest charge as slander. They point out that Tacitus, the most reliable source, never states it outright, only records that suspicion existed. Suetonius and Dio, writing decades later, were more concerned with entertainment than accuracy. And yet the fact that Rome believed it, or wanted to believe it, is what matters most. The incest rumour was not a reflection of Agrippina's reality, it was a reflection of Rome's anxieties. For the Romans, incest was not merely forbidden sex, it was a metaphor for disorder. It meant a world turned upside down, where mothers became lovers, sons became husbands, power became perversion. In a dynasty already haunted by scandals, Messalina accused of brothels, Caligula of debauchery, Claudius of foolishness, incest was the final, darkest brushstroke. Thus the image of Agrippina as seductress, Nero as corrupted son, became part of Rome's imagination. Plays were whispered about in taverns, poets joked in biting satire, historians immortalized it in their annals. By the time Nero was dead in AD 68, the story was fixed. The boy emperor had not only murdered his mother, he had shared her bed. And here is the cruelest irony. Agrippina, who fought so hard to secure her place in history, who placed her son on the throne, was remembered not for her ambition, her strategy, or her political brilliance, but for a whisper that grew into accusation into legend. Whether or not she ever touched her son in the way Rome believed, history touched her with the mark of incest. The story of Nero and Agrippina was never simply a tale of mother and son. It was a theatre of rivals, women who sought influence in a palace where affection was currency and intimacy was power. And in this contest, every rival mistress became both a lover to Nero and an enemy to Agrippina. It was in this crucible that the incest rumours flourished, sharpened and weaponized. The first woman who dared to rival Agrippina for Nero's attention was Claudia Acte, a freedwoman of Greek origin. Ancient sources describe her as beautiful, discreet and loyal, the kind of woman who could make Nero feel adored without threatening his fragile ego. Tacitus Annal 1312 records that Nero fell in love with Acte not long after ascending the throne in AD 54. She was hardly an obvious choice for an emperor. A freedwoman, once a slave, had no standing in Rome's rigid aristocracy. To Agrippina, who dreamed of alliances forged through imperial marriage, Acte was an insult, a stain on the dignity of her dynasty. Agrippina made her disapproval clear. Tacitus tells us she raged at Nero, mocking him for debasing himself with a woman of servile background. Worse, Agrippina began to treat Acte not as a personal irritation but as a political rival. She accused her of seducing the emperor away from the duties of state, of distracting him from the serious business of ruling. Tacitus hints that Agrippina even threatened to expose Nero's shame, a phrase many historians read as the incest rumour itself. In other words, Agrippina was willing to whisper that she and her son were lovers, if only to remind Nero of her hold on him. The tension between Agrippina and Acte soon grew into open conflict. Agrippina stormed into Nero's chambers, scolding him like a boy, warning that the Senate would despise him for his choice of mistress. Nero, humiliated, began to pull away. According to some accounts, he even turned to Seneca and Burrus, his philosopher tutor and the Praetorian prefect, for advice on how to balance his mother's dominance with his own desires. Their solution was cautious: allow Acte her place, but do not alienate Agrippina entirely. But the damage was done. Here, the incest whispers gained a sharper edge. Actic supporters, senators who resented Agrippina's power, began to circulate stories that explained Agrippina's fury. Why was she so jealous of Actics? Why did she storm into Nero's bedchamber? The answer, whispered in taverns and written into history, was that she was not jealous as a mother, but as a lover. The rumour began to grow. Nero was sleeping with his mother, and Acte was stealing him away. Agrippina's rage, therefore, was not maternal, but sexual. Whether Tacitus believed this or not, he records the atmosphere. Agrippina was seen as unnaturally close to her son, and Acte's presence made that closeness scandalous. But if Acte was a thorn in Agrippina's side, the true rival who shattered her influence was Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was everything Acte was not: aristocratic, ambitious, and dazzlingly beautiful. Born into a noble family, she had already been married twice, once to Rufius Crispinus, a Praetorian commander, and then to Otho, a close friend of Nero. Ancient writers describe her as a woman of intoxicating charm. Tacitus paints her as manipulative, Suetonius as ruthlessly ambitious, Cassius Dio as dangerously seductive. She was, in short, the perfect rival for Agrippina. Baiae 58. Poppaea had become Nero's obsession, and unlike Acte, she was not content to remain a mistress. She wanted the throne. To achieve it, she needed to eliminate two obstacles: Octavia, Nero's wife, and Agrippina, his mother. According to Tacitus, Annals 14:1, Poppaea quickly learned how to turn Nero's frustrations against Agrippina. She mocked him for being ruled by a woman, accusing him of weakness. She whispered that as long as Agrippina lived, Nero would never be truly free. But she went further. Suetonius, Nero 28, claims that Poppaea poisoned Nero's mind by suggesting Agrippina's control was not just political, but sexual. If his mother's influence seemed unnatural, she told him it was because it was unnatural, the product of an incestuous bond. This was genius slander. By framing Agrippina's dominance as rooted in incest, Poppaea achieved two things at once. She humiliated Nero by painting him as corrupted, and she demonized Agrippina by casting her as a monstrous seductress. In Rome, nothing was more degrading than the idea of incest. To whisper it was to wound deeply, and Poppaea whispered it again and again. The more Nero listened to her, the colder he grew toward Agrippina. Their public quarrels escalated. Agrippina accused him of neglecting Octavia, his lawful wife. She railed against his late-night escapades, his passion for music, his growing debauchery. But Nero now had a new voice in his ear, one far more pleasing than the sharp tongue of his mother. Poppaea's laughter drowned out Agrippina's warnings. The rivalry between these two women was not just personal, it was mythic. Agrippina represented the old order, the mother who had placed her son on the throne demanding obedience. Poppaea represented the new, the seductive mistress who promised Nero freedom and pleasure, and Rome, ever hungry for drama, cast their battle in the language of sex. If Nero resisted his mother, it was because he was tired of her bed. If he listened to Poppaea, it was because she offered what his mother could not. Here the incest allegation became more than a rumour. It became a weapon. Poppaea did not need to prove it, she only needed to suggest it. The more Agrippina scolded Nero, the more it looked like a lover's jealousy. The more she appeared in public with him, the more it resembled the behaviour of a wife. By the time Nero began plotting Agrippina's death in AD 59, the charge of incest had already spread so widely that it became part of her downfall. Tacitus, writing half a century later, still framed it carefully as suspicion, as gossip. But Suetonius and Dio, drawing on the poisonous atmosphere of the late empire, repeated it as fact. Poppaea's whispers had done their work. Agrippina was remembered less as the woman who made Nero emperor, and more as the woman accused of sharing his bed. Yet modern historians caution us to read between the lines. There is no hard evidence of incest. What we see, instead, is the pattern of Roman rumour. Powerful women accused of monstrous sexuality, whether Messalina with her brothel, Julia the Elder with her lovers, or Agrippina with her son. For male historians, it was easier to explain female power with scandal than with strategy. A mother who ruled her son could not simply be intelligent or ruthless. She must also be corrupt, sexually perverse, unnatural. Still, the voices of Acte and Poppaea linger in this story. Acte, the humble freedwoman, inadvertently fanned the flames of rumour by making Agrippina jealous. Poppaea, the aristocratic schemer, deliberately weaponized those flames to burn Agrippina's reputation to ash. Between them, they ensured that the incest allegations would endure not only in Nero's lifetime, but in history itself. Thus, the rival mistresses were more than footnotes in Nero's tale. They were catalysts, accelerants. Without them, the whispers might have remained whispers. With them, the whispers became legend, and it was this legend that prepared the stage for what came next. Nero's attempt to murder his mother, first with a collapsing boat, and then with the dagger of assassins. It was AD 59, the 5th year of Nero's reign, when whispers became steel. The emperor, just 21 years old, had grown weary of his mother's shadow. Agrippina the Younger, who had clawed her way to the pinnacle of Roman power through marriage, murder and manipulation, was now too visible, too loud, too demanding, to his mistresses, to his allies, and even to himself. Nero looked like a boy still tethered to his mother's hand, and in the court of Rome, where every gesture was political theatre, perception was power. But how does a son remove the mother who made him emperor? This was Nero's dilemma. Agrippina had enemies, plenty of senators and courtiers longed for her fall. Yet she also had allies, loyal freedmen, and the dignity of her bloodline as a descendant of Augustus. To strike her down openly would scandalize Rome, perhaps destabilize the throne. So Nero conceived of something more cunning, a murder disguised as an accident. The stage was set at Baiae, a glittering resort town on the Bay of Naples. Baiae was Rome's playground, a place of villas, banquets and whispered affairs. Its warm waters and decadent villas made it the perfect setting for imperial intrigue. Here, under the guise of reconciliation, Nero invited his mother to dine and then return by sea. What awaited her was not reconciliation, but a trap. According to Tacitus, Annals 14, 3-6, Nero entrusted the plan to Tacitus, the commander of the imperial fleet at Misenum. Tacitus was no stranger to Agrippina's wrath. Years earlier, Agrippina had scorned him and mocked his low birth. Now the opportunity for revenge came wrapped in imperial command. Tacitus's task was diabolical but ingenious. Construct a collapsible boat, a vessel designed to fall apart mid-voyage, sending its passenger into the depths of the bay. The design was simple in principle, sinister in execution. Heavy lead weights were fastened to the roof of the cabin, disguised as ornamental fittings. At the pull of a trigger, the roof would collapse, crushing those inside. If that failed, mechanisms hidden in the hull would break apart, ensuring the sea finished what the roof did not. The plotters reasoned that no one would suspect foul play if Agrippina drowned in a maritime accident. After all, the seas claimed many lives, even noble ones. The day of the banquet arrived. Nero greeted his mother with outward warmth, masking his inner malice. Tacitus describes him feigning affection, embracing her as if the rift between them had healed. Agrippina, for her part, was no fool. She had survived the deadly intrigues of Caligula's court, the paranoia of Claudius, and the knives of rivals. She knew her son's heart was cooling toward her, but perhaps even she did not imagine that matricide could be dressed in the finery of a dinner party. The feast was sumptuous, glittering with the extravagance of an emperor. Wine flowed, torches flickered against marble, musicians played as Nero laughed too loudly. Agrippina reclined among the courtiers, radiant in her maturity, her beauty still formidable though she was in her early 40s. To those watching, it looked like mother and son had reconciled, but beneath the surface, death was already waiting. When the banquet ended, Nero escorted his mother to the shore, where her vessel awaited. The night was calm, the stars reflected in the still waters of the bay. Agrippina boarded the boat with her attendants, unaware that every plank was a conspiracy. With farewells exchanged, the sailors pushed off, and the vessel drifted into the dark. What happened next was chaos. Tacitus recounts that the weighted roof mechanism was triggered, but instead of killing Agrippina outright, it merely crushed one of her attendants. The rest of the structure failed to collapse as planned. The boat began to break apart, but not decisively. Some timbers splintered, some beams gave way, but the craft did not sink swiftly as intended. Instead, confusion erupted. Screams pierced the night as sailors pretended to panic, throwing themselves into the water. In the confusion, Agrippina understood the truth. This was no accident. This was murder, and the hand behind it was her son's. Yet survival, not confrontation, was her instinct. She leapt into the water. Despite her age and heavy garments, she swam desperately toward the shore. Accounts vary, but Tacitus insists she was aided by fate. The sea was calm, the moonlight clear, and she managed to escape the wreckage. By sheer will, Agrippina reached the coastline and stumbled ashore, drenched, breathless, but alive. News of her survival spread like wildfire through Baiae. In the silence of the imperial villa, word reached Nero that his mother had cheated death. Panic seized him. What would she do now? Would she march into the Senate, proclaiming that the emperor had tried to kill his own mother? Would the Roman people revolt at the horror of matricide? Nero's imagination tormented him with visions of betrayal, disgrace, and downfall. Here the sources diverge slightly. Tacitus claims Agrippina, ever the strategist, tried to cloak the event. She sent a message to Nero, claiming gratitude for the accident, but insisting she was unharmed. It was her way of signalling that she would not expose him, that she was still willing to play the game of appearances. But Nero did not trust her. Suetonius and Dio suggest that Nero's fear of exposure drove him into a frenzy. His mother, alive, was too dangerous. So Nero chose a darker path. If the sea could not finish the deed, the dagger would. He sent a nicer again, this time not with tricks but with assassins. Soldiers stormed Agrippina's villa under the cover of night. They surrounded her chambers, blades drawn. Agrippina's servants fled or were cut down. The empress herself, cornered, stood to face them. The sources preserve her final defiance. She bared her body and cried, "Strike my womb, for it bore Nero." The assassins obliged. Agrippina was stabbed to death in her villa, her body abandoned to silence. Thus ended the life of the woman who had given Rome its emperor, slain by the very child she had raised for the throne. To Rome, the story of the collapsing boat became legend. It was a parable of hubris, of unnatural power, of the horror of a son who sought his mother's death. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio all preserve it with variations, but the image of the doomed vessel drifting into the night remains one of the most vivid in Roman history. Whether every detail is true, whether the mechanics of the boat were real or embroidered, hardly matters. To contemporaries it was symbolic, an emperor destroying not only his mother, but the natural order itself. The scandal did not end with Agrippina's death. Instead, it deepened. For Rome, matricide was a crime beyond comprehension. Combined with the incest rumours that already surrounded them, the failed boat and the stabbing became proof to many that Nero was no ordinary tyrant. He was a monster, a ruler who sought power at the cost of blood and nature alike. The story of the collapsible boat was repeated for centuries, whispered in courts and copied by chroniclers, each time reminding readers of the night when Rome's emperor tried to drown his own mother beneath the stars of Baiae. The sea had failed him. The collapsing boat, Nero's elaborate invention of deception and death, had betrayed its purpose. Instead of swallowing Agrippina in the waters of Baiae, it had carried her to shore alive, gasping but unbroken. Now, within the flickering lamps of his villa, Nero raged. Every shadow seemed to mock him. Every whisper in the corridors seemed to carry the word matricide. Tacitus, ever Rome's moral historian, paints the scene in trembling strokes. Nero, pacing in terror, awaited word of his mother's demise. But instead of triumph, a messenger arrived with dreadful news. Agrippina had survived. She had swum to shore. She was safe. Worse, she had sent him a message of reconciliation, claiming gratitude for his concern, assuring him she was unharmed. As if it had been a mere accident, the mask of civility was intact. She had not accused him. She had not screamed treason to the Senate. She had done nothing yet. But Nero could not breathe. To him, silence was more dangerous than accusation. If Agrippina remained alive, she held the blade above his head. She could wait, bide her time, and strike when he was weakest. Every gesture of hers was political calculation. What if she appeared before the Praetorian Guard and reminded them that she, not Nero, was the blood of Augustus? What if she called the Senate to her side, denouncing him as an ungrateful child who had sought her murder? What if she allied with Britannicus's supporters, who still mourned the boy Nero had poisoned? Nero's fear became paranoia, and paranoia became resolve. He called for Tacitus, the commander of the fleet, his co-conspirator in the botched boat plan. Tacitus was more than a servant. He was a man with grudges, resentments, and ambitions. For him, Agrippina was not only the emperor's mother, but also the woman who had mocked his low birth years earlier. Now Nero gave him the order that history would not forget: finish what the sea had failed to do. The villa at Baiae, where Agrippina rested, was magnificent, yet ominous that night. Agrippina, perhaps sensing the storm approaching, retreated to her chambers. Tacitus tells us she had been injured during her escape, bruised, cut, her body aching from the swim and the collapse of the boat. But she was alive, alive enough to think, alive enough to plan her next move. Perhaps she believed her son would be shamed by the failure, perhaps even reconciled. Or perhaps she knew the truth, that survival had only bought her a few more hours. The assassins came in silence, the night heavy with anticipation, and Tacitus led them, accompanied by a band of sailors and soldiers. They surrounded the villa, extinguishing lamps, cutting off escape. The sound of sandals on stone echoed in the corridors as they advanced. Servants shrieked and fled. Some were cut down where they stood. In her chamber, Agrippina understood. She had been around death her entire life. Her father, Germanicus, poisoned in the east. Her brothers exiled, murdered, consumed by Caligula's cruelty. She had married power, and power had demanded blood. She had orchestrated the death of her rivals, perhaps even her husband Claudius. But now the circle was closing. According to Tacitus, she stood tall as the assassins burst into her room. A lamp flickered against her face, showing not terror but grim defiance. They drew their blades. One struck at her head and only grazed her shoulder. She bared her body, exposing her womb, and shouted words that would echo through the centuries. "Strike here! Strike my womb, for it bore Nero!" It was both a curse and a command, a mother's final defiance. If Nero wished her dead, then let him destroy the very womb that had delivered him to Rome. Let history know that an emperor had spilled the blood of the body that had made him. The assassins obeyed. Blades flashed in the lamplight, plunging into flesh. Agrippina collapsed, her life spilling into the stones of her villa. Her attendants were slain or scattered, the villa echoing with screams that quickly died into silence. When it was done, her body lay still, a shadow of the woman who had once ruled the empire from behind the throne. Nero waited for confirmation. When Anicestus returned with word that the deed was complete, the emperor is said to have been shaken, not relieved. Tacitus describes him as stunned, unable to believe he had crossed the boundary from parricide in intent to parricide. In fact, the enormity of the act pressed upon him. He had not merely killed a rival, he had murdered his own mother, the woman who had birthed and crowned him. In Roman eyes it was among the greatest sins imaginable. To the Senate and to Rome at large, Nero attempted a performance. He sent messengers declaring that Agrippina had plotted against him, that she had sought his life, that he had acted only to defend himself. He tried to paint the murder as justice. Statues were removed, honours revoked, her memory blackened. Yet the whispers of incest and matricide joined together, forming an image of Nero as something beyond tyrant, as something unnatural. The story spread like wildfire. Agrippina stabbed in her villa, begging them to strike her womb. Nero, the boy emperor, turned monster. The details may have been embroidered by Tacitus, by Suetonius, by Cassius Dio, each with their own biases and vendettas. Yet to the Roman imagination the truth mattered less than the image, a son drenched in his mother's blood. For years afterward, Nero was haunted by visions. Suetonius claims he saw Agrippina's ghost, her face pale, her wounds still fresh, appearing in the night to torment him. He summoned magicians, priests and sorcerers to banish her spirit, but no ritual could cleanse matricide. The Senate remembered, the people remembered, his court whispered, and though he reigned for nearly another decade, Nero never escaped the shadow of that night. The villa at Baiae became infamous. To walk its halls was to feel the weight of scandal. To look out over the calm waters of the bay was to see not beauty but betrayal. Even centuries later, chroniclers spoke of it with awe and horror, as the place where Rome's darkest family drama reached its climax. Agrippina's death was not just a murder, it was a political earthquake. Rome had seen emperors kill rivals, senators, even wives. But mothers? To shed maternal blood was to strike at the very heart of Roman values. Pietas, duty to family, duty to the gods, duty to Rome itself. Nero had broken all three. The whispers of incest now gained even sharper teeth. If he could kill his mother, why would he not also have slept with her? If he had crossed one taboo, what kept him from crossing another? The rumours, the scandals, the whispers were woven together into a tapestry of monstrosity. Whether true or not, they clung to Nero like a cloak of shame. Tacitus ends the tale with bitter commentary. Nero believed that with Agrippina gone, he had freed himself. But in truth, He had chained himself forever to the darkest of crimes. The memory of Agrippina's womb, her final words, her curse, haunted Rome. For as long as the empire lasted, Nero would be remembered as the emperor who not only killed his mother, but according to rumour, had first shared her bed. The deed was done. The womb that had borne Rome's emperor now lay split by the blade. In the stillness of Agrippina's villa at Baiae, the scent of iron and smoke clung to the air. Her lifeless body, once cloaked in imperial dignity, now sprawled across cold stone, and yet, in the very moment of her death, the true weight of the act had only begun to descend. For Nero, matricide was not an ending, but the opening of a chasm. In Roman society, the act of killing one's parent was considered one of the gravest sins imaginable. Pietas, the duty owed to family, the gods, and Rome, was the cornerstone of Roman morality. A man who violated this sacred obligation was worse than a murderer. He was an enemy of the gods, cursed by the fates themselves. To kill one's mother was not merely a crime, it was a cosmic inversion of natural order. Tacitus, in his Annals, Book 14:8-9, describes the aftermath with chilling simplicity. Nero attempted to mask the crime, declaring that Agrippina had plotted treason, that her death was a just punishment. But the Senate was not fooled, and neither was the public. Whispers filled Rome's forums, markets and taverns. The emperor had slain his mother. The first challenge Nero faced was political theatre. He knew that Rome had to be persuaded, or at least pacified. He could not allow the people, the Praetorian Guard, or the Senate to view the act as unprovoked murder, so he orchestrated a cover story. Messengers were dispatched announcing that Agrippina had conspired against him, planning to murder her own son and seize power. The claim was absurd, but it gave Nero a script. Agrippina, once Rome's most powerful woman, would now be recast as Rome's most treacherous traitor. The Senate, cowed and weary after years of imperial brutality, played along. A decree was issued stripping Agrippina of her honours. Her statues were toppled, her name removed from inscriptions. The official record would not list her as the mother of the emperor, but as a conspirator who had received her due punishment. It was, in every sense, a second death, the erasure of her dignity, her memory, her legacy. Yet the truth was harder to kill. Rumours flowed through Rome's streets like blood from an open wound. Servants and witnesses whispered of Agrippina's last words. "Strike my womb, for it bore Nero." The Senate halls could silence the official record, but it could not silence the taverns, the marketplaces, the soldiers on their night watch. To the people, the story of Nero's crime became darker in the retelling. Some said that Nero had been drunk when he ordered the killing, laughing as he signed the command. Others swore that he had trembled in fear, driven not by malice but by madness. Suetonius, writing decades later, embroidered the tale with images of Nero haunted by his mother's ghost, her pale face and bloody wounds appearing to him in nightmares. He summoned magicians and exorcists to banish her spirit, but still she returned. Agrippina had died once, but in Nero's mind she lived forever. The scandal reverberated beyond Rome, across the provinces, where loyalty to the Julio-Claudian dynasty was shaky. Agrippina had been a figure of legitimacy. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the bloodline itself. With her death, that aura fractured. To provincials, the emperor had not merely slain his mother, he had cut his dynasty's roots. The question grew louder. If Nero could murder Agrippina, what else was he capable of? Even the gods, it seemed, recoiled. Omens filled the skies in the months after her death. Tacitus reports that storms struck with unusual violence. Lightning ignited sacred groves and monstrous births were recorded in Italy. To Romans, these were not coincidences but messages. The gods had marked Nero as cursed. The stigma of matricide in Roman thought was almost unthinkable. Normally, a man guilty of such a crime could expect the ponacullae, the punishment of the sack, where the condemned was sewn into a sack with serpents, dogs, or monkeys, and thrown into the river. It was a punishment reserved for those who had severed the natural bond of parent and child. Nero, of course, was emperor, immune to such laws, but the shadow of the punishment hovered nonetheless. He had committed the crime without suffering its penalty, and Rome knew it. Agrippina's villa, where the murder took place, became a site of morbid fascination. Visitors whispered of the bloodstains that could not be scrubbed away, of the walls that seemed to echo with her dying cry. The Bay of Baiae, once a place of leisure and pleasure, became for some a haunted shore, marked by unnatural sin. The water that had failed to claim Agrippina was now cursed by her ghost. For Nero himself, the aftermath was complex. At first he sought comfort in indulgence. Banquets, orgies, music and performances filled his nights. He tried to drown the memory in wine and song, declaring himself an artist, a god among mortals. But guilt seeped into the cracks. Tacitus and Suetonius agree. Nero was haunted. He claimed to see Agrippine, spectre, sometimes bleeding, sometimes silent, standing at the foot of his bed. He consulted Chaldean astrologers, Egyptian magicians, Greek philosophers, anyone who might tell him that the gods had forgiven him, that his mother's ghost was appeased. None could silence her. To his enemies, Nero's crime became a political weapon. Senators who despised him invoked Agrippina's memory in whispers. Soldiers, disillusioned with imperial excess, spoke of the emperor who had dared strike down his own mother. The Praetorian Guard, once fiercely loyal to the dynasty, grew restless. Every rebellion that would later arise against Nero carried the spectre of Agrippina's murder as part of its rhetoric. Rome must not be ruled by a matricide. But the darkest consequence was psychological. Nero, by killing Agrippina, had severed not only his political tether but his emotional anchor. For all her ambition, Agrippina had been his protector, the architect of his rise, the blood that legitimized his rule. With her gone, he was unmoored. He spiraled further into excess and cruelty, seeking to fill the void with acts that pushed Rome deeper into horror. The execution of rivals, the public humiliations, even the burning of Rome in AD 64. And yet, the incest rumour entwined itself with the matricide in Rome's imagination. If Nero could kill his mother, perhaps he had also lain with her. The two scandals fed one another, shaping a legend darker than truth. The image of Agrippina and Nero, mother and son, bed and blade, became inseparable. Roman gossip turned crime into mythology, and mythology into history. By AD 59, Nero had survived the immediate crisis. The Senate had bowed, the Guard had obeyed, and his throne was secure. But in securing it through matricide, he had planted the seeds of his destruction. Rome never forgot. When the final revolt came in AD 68, when Nero fled the city and took his own life, the people did not remember his music or his art. They remembered his mother's cry, "Strike my womb, for it bore Nero." The aftermath of Agrippina's death was not measured in days or months, but in years of whispers and shadows. Nero's reign became a theatre of monstrosity, and his name became a symbol of sin. To this day, when Rome is remembered for its emperors, Nero is recalled not as the artist or the ruler, but as the boy who killed his mother and perhaps loved her too much. The death of Agrippina in AD 59 marked more than just the silencing of a powerful woman. It marked the unchaining of her son. For as long as she lived, Agrippina had been Nero's shadow and his conscience, even if only through fear. She had dominated his early reign, placing allies in key positions, guiding his speeches, and pulling his strings when he was too young or inexperienced to lead. But once the dagger fell in Baiae, and the womb that bore him was struck down, there was no one left to restrain him. What emerged in her absence was a man consumed by appetites for power, for pleasure, for spectacle, a man who seemed to take the whispers of Rome and perform them as though they were scripts written for him. Ancient sources such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all agree on one point. Nero descended into excess after his mother's murder, and yet their accounts differ in detail, each author embellishing, moralizing, or weaponizing his story for their own purposes. It is difficult to separate fact from slander, but the composite picture is chilling. Nero is remembered not as a steady ruler, nor even as a tyrant in the mould of Tiberius or Domitian, but as a monster, a creature of unnatural lusts, theatrical cruelty, and perverse pride. The artist on the throne. The first transformation was cultural. Nero declared himself not merely emperor, but artist. He saw music, poetry, and performance not as diversions but as the highest form of human achievement. The Roman elite, steeped in the tradition of gravitas and dignity, recoiled at the sight of their emperor strumming the cithara, reciting Greek tragedies, or appearing on stage in theatrical masks. To Romans, the theatre was associated with prostitution and servility, not imperial majesty. Yet Nero revelled in it. Suetonius tells us that he would force senators and knights to attend his performances, locking the theatre doors so no one could leave. Some feigned illness to escape, others endured hours of music and verse, their ears assaulted while their dignity crumbled. Pregnant women were said to have gone into labour during Nero's endless recitals. One senator pretended to die to be carried out. Whether these anecdotes are true or not, they paint a picture of an emperor whose desire for artistic glory outweighed the patience of his audience. To Nero, art was not play acting, it was divinity. He famously declared, "What an artist dies in me," before his suicide in AD 68. But long before that final moment, he had already sought to shape Rome into his stage. Orgies and perverse unions. If Nero's public performances scandalized the Senate, his private appetites horrified even more. The rumors of incest with Agrippina, already whispered before her death, now fused with stories of sexual depravity that spiraled beyond imagination. One of the most infamous tales concerns Sporus, a young boy whom Nero allegedly had castrated and then married in a mock ceremony. Suetonius, Nero 28, writes that Nero dressed Sporus in the garments of an empress, parading him through the streets as though he were his wife. The boy, mutilated and humiliated, became both spectacle and victim. Some sources even suggest that Nero referred to Sporus as Sabina, in twisted remembrance of his former wife Poppaea Sabina, who died under mysterious circumstances, some said from a kick to the belly while pregnant. To the Roman moral imagination, such acts were proof of monstrosity. A ruler was expected to embody virtue, masculinity, and self-restraint. Nero instead flaunted emasculation, role reversal, and parody of sacred marriage rites. He seemed determined to violate every taboo Rome held sacred, as though daring the gods themselves to intervene. The Great Fire of Rome, AD 64. No episode illustrates Nero's descent into infamy more than the Great Fire of Rome. On the night of July 18 AD 64, flames erupted in the Circus Maximus and swept through the city for 9 days, consuming temples, houses, and markets. Tacitus, Annals 1538-44, records that out of Rome's 14 districts, 3 were completely destroyed and only 4 escaped damage. Thousands were left homeless, their lives reduced to ashes. And in the smoke of that catastrophe rose the most enduring rumour of all, that Nero himself had ordered the city set aflame. Some claimed he wished to clear space for his new palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a sprawling complex of marble halls, gilded ceilings, and gardens so vast they swallowed entire neighbourhoods. Others whispered that Nero had watched the fire from his palace, singing the sack of Troy while Rome itself burned. Tacitus, ever cautious, admits the truth is uncertain. Perhaps Nero did not start the fire, but he certainly capitalized on it. The Domus Aurea became a symbol of imperial arrogance, a monument to indulgence built on the bones of the city. The people, already unsettled by matricide and rumours of incest, now believed their emperor capable of anything. In order to deflect suspicion, Nero turned to scapegoating. He blamed the fire on a small, despised sect of religious fanatics, the Christians. According to Tacitus, Christians were arrested and executed in grotesque ways, torn apart by dogs, crucified, or burned alive as human torches to light Nero's gardens. It was one of the earliest state persecutions of Christianity, born not from ideology, but from the emperor's need to shield himself from guilt. The cruelty shocked even hardened Romans. To them, the Christians were strange and foreign, but the punishment seemed excessive, even monstrous. The image of burning bodies illuminating Nero's feasts reinforced the idea that their emperor was no longer merely a man. He was something darker, the spiral of excess. After the fire, Nero's spiral deepened. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated as he indulged in paranoia and executions. Anyone suspected of disloyalty could be accused of treason, maiestas, their estates confiscated, their blood spilled. Senators and nobles were forced to die by suicide to preserve some dignity, their families ruined. The philosopher Seneca, once Nero's tutor, was among those ordered to take his own life in AD 65 after the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot that sought to restore dignity to Rome by eliminating its monster emperor. Nero's response to opposition was not mere suppression, it was theatrical cruelty. Executions were staged as performances. Trials became spectacles. Rome was no longer ruled by law, but by the whims of an emperor who considered his reign a drama in which he was both playwright and star. The monster image. The incest rumours, long simmering, now fused with these excesses into a single monstrous identity. If Nero could kill his mother, he could sleep with her. If he could marry a castrated boy, he could burn his city. The Roman imagination, steeped in morality tales, saw him not as a flawed man, but as an embodiment of chaos, a breaker of natural and divine order. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, called Nero the enemy of humankind. Later Christian writers would cast him as the Antichrist, the beast foretold in Revelation. Whether these claims were exaggerations or propaganda, they reveal how deeply the image of Nero the monster had taken root. Haunted by ghosts. Yet even monsters have shadows of humanity. Suetonius describes Nero plagued by nightmares of his mother Agrippina and of Octavia, his first wife, whom he executed on false charges of adultery. The ghosts of the women he had wronged, mother, wives, mistresses, returned to torment him. He sought solace in magicians, sacrifices, and exotic rites, but nothing stilled his visions. The emperor who had crowned himself artist could not escape the play written by his own sins. By the late 60s AD, Rome's provinces had grown restless. Rebellions sparked in Gaul, Spain, and Judea. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, grew tired of their artist emperor. When the Senate finally declared him a public enemy in AD 68, Nero fled the city, abandoned by those who once bowed before him. But his end belongs to another chapter. For now, in the aftermath of matricide and amid the embers of his city, Nero had fully become what rumour and slander had crafted, Rome's monster. The boy who once strummed a lyre in innocence had become the man who lit his gardens with human flames. The true power of a scandal in Rome was not whether it was real, but whether it was believed. And in the hands of historians, enemies, and political rivals, the rumour of incest between Nero and Agrippina became a blade sharper than any assassin's dagger. Rome was a city where gossip travelled faster than law, where the whispered word carried the weight of decree, and where reputations were built and broken, not by truth but by perception. If Nero had truly lain with his mother, it was monstrous, but if he had not, the mere suspicion was enough to destroy him all the same. When Agrippina first placed her teenage son upon the throne in AD 54, she became the most visible woman in the empire. Coins were minted bearing her image alongside his, an unthinkable act for a Roman matron, for women were never meant to appear as equals to men in matters of state. She sat at his side in public audiences, rode with him in a litter through the streets, and even received foreign delegations at his side. To the Roman elite, this was not the behaviour of a dutiful mother but of a co-ruler, and in their patriarchal imagination there was only one way to explain such audacity. She must have been using her body to control her son. Tacitus, the ever-cautious moralist, described her presence as excessive, her affection too close, her guidance too heavy. Suetonius, ever eager for scandal, claimed the two were seen reclining together in ways that crossed the line of decency. And Dio Cassius, writing generations later, repeats the whispers that Agrippina would flaunt herself in sheer clothing before Nero, teasing and testing his resolve. Whether these accounts hold even a grain of truth hardly mattered. What mattered was that the Roman mind, steeped in centuries of equating powerful women with sexual depravity, was ready to believe them. For in Rome, the female body was never simply flesh, it was politics. A man's honour rested on the chastity of his wife, the obedience of his daughters, the modesty of his mother. A woman who transgressed those bounds did not merely disgrace herself, she undermined the entire household, the very building block of Roman order. And when that woman was Agrippina, mother to the emperor himself, her transgressions were magnified to cosmic proportions. To imagine her sharing a bed with her son was to imagine the collapse of the natural world, the inversion of family, the destruction of order itself. It was a weapon too sharp to resist, and so it was wielded without mercy. The incest rumour was not born in a vacuum. It followed a tradition of using sexual slander as the surest way to dismantle a rival's power. Julius Caesar himself had once been mocked as the Queen of Bithynia for allegedly submitting to the foreign king Nicomedes. Mark Antony had been derided as Cleopatra's slave, unmanly and emasculated, and Messalina, the wife of Claudius and mother of Nero's half-brother Britannicus, had been immortalized as a nymphomaniac who crept into brothels under false names. When Rome wanted to discredit a figure, it reached for sex and incest, being the vilest of all perversions, was the ultimate accusation. In Nero's case, the scandal did double work. It tainted Agrippina by painting her as a seductress who sought to rule through lust, and it tainted Nero by casting him as a son so corrupted, so weak, that he surrendered to the embraces of his own mother. It was an accusation designed not only to disgust but to emasculate, to render both mother and son unfit for rule. Rome's men, especially the senators who still dreamed of their fading republic, whispered it in their halls with relish. Each retelling was less about truth and more about revenge, a way to strike at the imperial family without raising a sword. Yet there was something particularly cruel in how these whispers survived, hardened and became the truth recorded by history. For historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, both writing long after Nero's death, the incest rumour became a shorthand for the corruption of the Julio-Claudian dynasty itself. The dynasty that had given Rome Augustus, its saviour, had also produced Caligula, the madman, and now Nero, the monster. To write about incest was to write about the rot at the very heart of the empire, a rot born of too much power concentrated in one family. In their pages, Nero and Agrippina became symbols rather than people, the son who killed his mother, and the mother who allegedly seduced her son. But propaganda is never neutral. Tacitus, for all his moral gravitas, was a senator writing in the age of the Flavians and the Antonines, regimes that rose after Nero's fall. To depict Nero as monstrous, to emphasize incest and matricide, was to justify the legitimacy of his successors. By presenting Nero as the nadir of human corruption, his fall became necessary, his death righteous, his memory a warning, and for the senators, still smarting from years of humiliation under an emperor who mocked their authority, there was satisfaction in recording every rumour as if it were fact. The incest weapon also carried with it a distinctly Roman irony. The very dynasty that was accused of violating every boundary of sexual morality was the same dynasty that traced its lineage to Venus herself through Aeneas and Augustus. They claimed divine ancestry, but to their critics their bloodline became not holy but polluted. Incest was the grotesque inversion of their divine birthright, the proof that what had begun with the goddess of love had ended in unnatural perversion. And the propaganda worked. Long after Nero was dead, long after the Flavians and Antonines had passed, the rumour clung like a stain that could never be washed away. Medieval chroniclers embroidered it, Renaissance writers dramatized it, and modern historians still debate it. Agrippina remains frozen in memory not as the brilliant strategist, the survivor of Caligula's court, or the woman who guided an empire at 16, but as the mother who allegedly took her son to bed. Nero, too, is not remembered for his early attempts at reform, nor for his patronage of the arts, but as the emperor who slept with his mother and then killed her. Thus the incest rumour was more than gossip. It was a political weapon of devastating power. It reduced complex lives to caricatures, stripped achievements of meaning, and replaced them with grotesque images that suited the purposes of those who came after. Nero may have been cruel, vain, even destructive, but he was also young, inexperienced, and trapped in a system that demanded absolute power while fearing it at the same time. Agrippina may have been ambitious, even ruthless, but she was also a woman navigating a world that gave her influence only through the men around her. Yet history did not allow them that nuance. History sharpened the rumour into a dagger and plunged it into their reputations, ensuring that no matter what else they had been, they would always be remembered as mother and son bound together in sin. And so we are left with the question, was it true? Did Nero and Agrippina truly cross that forbidden line, or was it all invention, the ultimate slander crafted to break them in life and damn them in death? The truth may never be known, but perhaps the truth matters less than the effect, for in Rome, as in all empires, power was not merely about swords and legions, it was about stories, and the story of the king who slept with his mother proved stronger, more enduring than any law or monument. It became the lens through which all of Nero's reign was judged, and it became the weapon by which both he and Agrippina were remembered not as rulers, not even as people, but as monsters. The accusation of incest was not merely a slander, it was a weaponized myth, a carefully sharpened tool in Rome's arsenal of propaganda. For to accuse a man or woman of incest was not to question their morality, it was to obliterate their legitimacy entirely. Incest in Roman thought was not simply a private sin, it was a violation of nature itself, an offence that polluted the bloodline, corroded the family, and by extension corrupted the very order of the state. To claim that Nero and Agrippina had shared a bed was to suggest that the empire itself had been poisoned at its heart, and in Rome that was enough to turn whispers into a legacy that still survives 2 millennia later. The Roman imagination was haunted by boundaries, by the fragility of the line between order and chaos. The family was the sacred foundation of Roman life. The father, or pater familias, stood as the pillar of authority, holding power over wife, children, and slaves. To transgress that structure was to invite disaster. Adultery was condemned, yet it was survivable. Rape was punished, though sometimes excused in war. But incest was a blasphemy. It was a reversal of nature, the collapse of hierarchy, the destruction of the household from within. In Roman moral law, there was nothing more monstrous. It is no accident, then, that when Rome sought to destroy its most infamous rulers and their mothers, it reached for this darkest of weapons. For Agrippina, who was already accused of poisoning her husband Claudius to elevate her son, the incest charge was a perfect extension. She was cast as the eternal temptress, the mother whose ambition was so boundless she would seduce her own flesh and blood. For Nero, who was already despised for vanity and cruelty, the accusation made him not merely unmanly but unholy, a son who had betrayed both his father's legacy and the natural order itself. The sources that repeat this charge, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, wrote in different generations, yet they all found the rumour too potent to ignore. Tacitus, ever cautious, presents the incest whispers as circulating rumour, suggesting they revealed more about public anxiety than proven fact. Suetonius, ever a collector of filth and scandal, records them without hesitation, eager to present Nero as Rome's ultimate degenerate. Dio, centuries later, repeats and magnifies, embedding the tale deeper into historical memory. The chain of retelling transformed gossip into history, insinuation into fact, and slander into legacy, and as each writer preserved it, they hardened the image of Agrippina and Nero into grotesque archetypes, the mother-lover and the son-corrupter. The irony is that incest rumours were not confined to Nero and Agrippina. They were a recurring theme in Roman propaganda. Caligula, Agrippina's own brother, had been accused of lying with his sisters, flaunting them at banquets, and treating them as wives. Julius Caesar as a youth was mocked as the lover of Nicomedes of Bithynia, an accusation that haunted him for decades. Cleopatra was slandered as both sister-wife and seductress of Rome's greatest men, her family's Ptolemaic practice of sibling marriage transformed into a weapon against her. To accuse was to stain forever. Rome understood that sexual perversion, especially within the family, was the most enduring stain of all. Why did such accusations carry such power? Because incest was the most potent metaphor for tyranny. To the Roman mind, tyranny was the perversion of politics, the seizure of power that should be shared, the corruption of public good for private gain. And incest mirrored tyranny in the family, the father's authority reversed, the son enslaved to his mother, the natural hierarchy inverted. It was not merely a sexual charge, it was political shorthand. To call Nero his mother's lover was to say that Rome itself had been raped by its rulers, that the empire was enslaved to a monstrous household. And yet, the accusations may have had less to do with reality than with perception. Agrippina, by daring to appear beside her son in public, by wearing purple robes, by sharing the stage with foreign ambassadors, crossed boundaries that Roman matrons were never meant to cross. To a culture obsessed with visibility and modesty, her prominence demanded explanation, and when the patriarchal imagination could not conceive of a woman wielding power legitimately, it explained it through the body. If Agrippina ruled Nero, it must have been through seduction. If she influenced him, it must have been in bed. Thus, incest became not a reflection of reality, but a justification for misogyny, a story men told themselves to make sense of a woman who refused to remain in the shadows. The rumour gained force in the years after her death, when Nero himself had spiralled into excess. The collapse of his rule made the incest charges retroactively believable. An emperor who sang in public, who raced chariots like a slave, who killed his mother, who castrated a boy and married him as a bride. Such a man could easily be imagined as having lain with his mother. In this way, The incest charge grew not from evidence but from plausibility. It fit the portrait of Nero as monster, so it was accepted as truth, and once written, it could not be erased. The weapon of incest slander also reveals something darker about Roman society itself. The people who repeated these rumours, senators, historians, later chroniclers, did not merely despise Nero or Agrippina. They feared what they represented: the collapse of male dominance, the intrusion of female ambition, the corruption of lineage. By painting Agrippina as seductress and Nero as victim or partner, they reaffirmed the moral boundaries they claimed to defend. The scandal became less about individuals and more about enforcing the rules of society. If Rome could demonize the empress who stepped beyond her role, then all women would be warned not to follow her path. If Rome could depict Nero as a man destroyed by his mother's lust, then future rulers would be reminded of the dangers of female influence. The incest tale was propaganda. Yes, but it was also a warning, a myth designed to preserve the structures of power. Even centuries later, the incest rumour clung to Nero and Agrippina like a shadow. Medieval chroniclers embroidered it with darker details, making Agrippina into a witch-like figure, Nero into the devil's apprentice. Renaissance playwrights transformed the story into tragedy, where mother and son became archetypes of forbidden desire. Modern historians, even while skeptical, cannot resist repeating it, if only to marvel at its endurance. For this is the cruel genius of propaganda. Even when denied, it survives. Even when disproven, it lingers. And so Nero remains not simply the emperor who murdered his mother, but the emperor who allegedly lay with her. Agrippina remains not simply the empress who sought power, but the mother who allegedly seduced her son. Their reputations are buried beneath centuries of scandal, their truth lost in the noise of rumour. What is left, then, is the recognition that incest was never really about sex. It was about power. It was about defining who could hold it, who could wield it, and how far one could go before being branded unnatural. For Nero and Agrippina, the accusation was fatal to their memory. It turned them from rulers into grotesques, from political figures into moral warnings. And in that transformation lies the true power of propaganda, to strip away humanity, to reduce a life to a single scandalous image, to ensure that centuries later we remember not the complexities but only the whispers. In the end, whether they ever crossed that forbidden line is almost irrelevant, for Rome believed it or wanted to believe it, and that belief shaped history. It became a story too delicious, too horrifying, to let go. It became the final proof that the Julio-Claudian dynasty, born of Augustus's careful order, had rotted into decadence and sin. And so the incest rumour survives not because it was true, but because it was useful. It was propaganda wielded with precision, propaganda that outlived its targets, propaganda that still shapes the way we speak of Nero and Agrippina today. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was born in glory but ended in rot. From Augustus, the careful architect of empire, to Nero, the scandal-ridden monster of rumour, it was a family haunted by whispers of blood and lust. Rome itself was the stage upon which their rise and fall unfolded, and the world's greatest city became a theatre of sin, where power and scandal blurred until they were indistinguishable. By the time Nero came to power, the dynasty was already infamous, stained with crimes, incestuous rumours, and sexual depravity. Nero's reign did not invent the darkness, it merely crowned it. At the dawn of empire, Augustus sought to secure Rome's morals as much as its borders. He crafted laws against adultery, promoting marriage and childbirth as the sacred duties of Roman citizens. Yet his own family betrayed his vision. His daughter Julia the Elder became notorious for her affairs, openly mocking her father's morality edicts. Exiled to a barren island, she became the first proof that Rome's first family could not live up to its own ideals. Her reputation became a whispering scandal, and though Augustus ruled for decades with strength, his family's weakness became a public spectacle. Even in this beginning, the seeds of Rome's darkest dynasty were planted. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, embodied the dynasty's descent into excess. Withdrawn, bitter, and paranoid, he retreated to the island of Capri, where ancient sources like Suetonius and Tacitus describe grotesque spectacles. Young boys trained as minnows, forced to swim between his thighs, orgies, perversions, and cruelties that turned his villa into a palace of sin. Whether exaggerated or not, the image endured. the Emperor of Rome, not ruling with dignity, but indulging in corruption behind closed doors. His reign was remembered less for governance and more for debauchery, and Rome's imagination began to expect its rulers to be monsters. Caligula followed, and with him came horror made flesh. Gaius, nicknamed Caligula, ruled only 4 years from AD 37 to 41. Yet his memory became a litany of atrocities. He was accused of incest with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, whom he allegedly treated as his wife. He was said to have prostituted his sisters to wealthy men, then reclaimed them as his own. He paraded them publicly, flaunting them in ways that unsettled even a jaded Rome. Beyond incest, he indulged in cruelty that bordered on the theatrical, forcing senators to watch executions, demanding divine honours, declaring himself a living god. Suetonius paints him as a man possessed, whose madness and lust were indistinguishable. In Caligula, Rome saw the dynasty at its most grotesque, a boy emperor whose excesses shattered the thin veneer of civilization. Yet it was not only the men of the dynasty who carried the stain. Messalina, the third wife of Emperor Claudius, became legend as Rome's prostitute empress. Accused of competing with a professional prostitute in a contest of stamina, said to have serviced 25 men in a single night, her reputation was annihilated by Juvenal and others who revelled in her fall. She was accused of running a brothel in disguise, of bedding senators, gladiators, and slaves alike. Though these tales may have been slander, they became history, and Messalina became a symbol of female lust run rampant. Her execution in AD 48, after conspiring with Gaius Silius, did not end the scandal, it immortalized it. Rome's first family was no longer just rulers, they were living, breathing satires of immorality. Then came Agrippina, Messalina's successor and Claudius's niece. Ambitious, calculating, ruthless. She was the embodiment of Rome's fear of powerful women. She orchestrated her marriage to Claudius, persuaded him to adopt her son Nero, and placed herself at the very centre of the empire's power. For some, she was brilliant, a stateswoman who ensured continuity. For others, she was monstrous, a woman who poisoned her husband, dominated her son, and seduced her way to supremacy. The incest rumour with Nero was not an isolated invention. It was the culmination of Rome's tendency to sexualize and demonize ambitious women. Agrippina's visibility, her voice, her presence beside her son on the dais, was unacceptable to a society that believed a woman's virtue lay in silence, and so her ambition was recast as lust, her power as perversion, her motherhood as incest. The dynasty's collapse was embodied in Nero, whose reign combined all the sins whispered about his predecessors into one monstrous portrait. He began as the Golden Boy, a youth guided by Seneca and Burrus, hailed as the promise of a new Rome. But as he grew older, his excesses became infamous. He killed his mother in AD 59, an act of matricide so shocking it eclipsed any of his other crimes. He was accused of burning Rome in AD 64, playing the lyre as flames consumed the city, though this was likely another exaggeration of his enemies. He indulged in public performances, racing chariots, singing on stage, acts considered shameful for an emperor. He married not once but multiple times, including marrying a castrated boy named Sporus, whom he dressed as his deceased wife Poppaea. Each act was framed by Rome's historians as unnatural, decadent, and unworthy. Combined with the incest rumours, these deeds cemented him as the dynasty's ultimate monster, the man who embodied every sin Rome feared. By the time the Julio-Claudian line ended in AD 68 with Nero's suicide, its reputation had been carved into scandal. From Augustus's failed moral reforms to Tiberius's perversions, from Caligula's incest to Messalina's brothel, from Agrippina's whispered lust to Nero's alleged union with his mother, the dynasty had become a catalogue of sins. Whether these tales were true, exaggerated, or invented, they formed a pattern too neat to ignore. Rome's first imperial family was remembered not for governance or conquest, but for sex, sin, and scandal. Their legacy was darkness. It is important to recognize, however, that much of this was shaped by the pens of hostile historians. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio all wrote with senatorial disdain, eager to condemn emperors who had diminished the Senate's power. To them, portraying rulers as incestuous, lustful, or depraved was not merely gossip, it was political revenge. To stain their memory was to reclaim some power. Thus, the dynasty became Rome's cautionary tale, a narrative of what happens when power corrupts, when women seek influence, when emperors surrender to lust. And yet the fascination endures. Modern readers and viewers still return to the Julio-Claudians, drawn by the mixture of fact and rumour, governance and scandal. They were not the only dynasty to rule Rome, but they were the first, and their reputation set the template for all who followed. In every tale of imperial decadence, in every rumour of orgy or incest, one hears echoes of Caligula, Messalina, Agrippina, Nero. They became archetypes of darkness, their sins immortalized by rumour more than reality. Thus, Rome's darkest dynasty was not merely a family, it was a myth, a story that grew in the telling, a narrative that blurred truth and propaganda until no distinction could be made. The Julio-Claudians were remembered not as rulers but as monsters, and in that memory Rome revealed as much about itself as about them, for it was Rome's own obsessions, Rome's fears of lust, power and women that gave life to these scandals. The dynasty's darkness was Rome's reflection, a mirror held up to its own anxieties. And so, from Augustus to Nero, from the island exile of Julia to the whispered bed of Nero and Agrippina, the Julio-Claudians live on as the embodiment of imperial corruption. Rome's darkest dynasty ended in blood, but its legend never died. It haunts history still. A story of power drowned in scandal, of empire corrupted by its own rulers, of a family remembered not for greatness but for whispers. The year was AD 68, and the Roman world had reached the end of its patience with Nero. The emperor who once stood as the youthful promise of the empire, now sat in his villa, abandoned by allies, deserted by the Praetorian Guard, cursed by the Senate. He had fled the city he once claimed as his stage, hiding from the inevitable judgment of a world that no longer tolerated his excesses. When word came that soldiers were closing in, Nero took his life with the aid of a servant, plunging a dagger into his throat. His final words, "Qualis artifex pero," "What an artist dies in me," carried not the dignity of a fallen ruler, but the theatricality of a man who had always seen his power as performance. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, Rome's first imperial bloodline, died with him. But it did not vanish, its shadow endured. In the aftermath of his suicide, Rome descended into chaos. The year of the four emperors followed, with Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian fighting for control. Yet amid the upheaval, Nero's name lingered in the minds of the people. Some Romans mourned him, not for his cruelty but for his theatricality, his games, his gifts to the plebs. For years after his death, rumours swirled of false Neros, impostors who claimed to be the emperor returned, finding followers in the eastern provinces. Such was the power of his legacy, a man reviled as a monster, but remembered so vividly that even pretenders could wear his shadow. But more lasting than any impostor was the stain upon his name, and upon the dynasty itself. The Julio-Claudians were not remembered as Rome's builders, but as its corruptors. Their reign, once promising stability after centuries of republican strife, was now etched in memory as a theatre of scandal. For Rome, incest, adultery and lust had become metaphors for misrule. To speak of Messalina's brothel was to speak of imperial weakness. To whisper of Caligula's incest was to remember tyranny. To retell the tale of Nero and Agrippina was to recall how power could become perversion. The dynasty had fallen, but its story lived on in rumour, dark and unending. What made these stories endure was not merely their scandalous nature, but their political utility. For senators humiliated by emperors, for later rulers seeking to contrast themselves against tyranny, the Julio-Claudians provided a treasury of moral lessons. Tacitus painted them as symbols of decadence. Suetonius embroidered their biographies with sexual grotesqueries. Cassius Dio repeated their scandals for posterity. Whether true or invented, the dynasty's sins became historical fact, preserved in ink for all time. And so, when later generations spoke of Rome's corruption, they spoke of this family, the emperors and empresses whose power was inseparable from whispers of incest and betrayal. The figure of Agrippina loomed largest in this legacy. Even in death, her shadow fell across history. To some, she was the monstrous mother who sought to dominate her son, who would stop at nothing to control the throne. To others, she was a victim of slander, a woman too powerful to be tolerated in a man's world, recast by hostile pens as a seductress of her own blood. Her assassination at Baiae, with her last command, "Strike my womb," became an eternal symbol, a woman destroyed not just by her son's dagger, but by the whisper of incest that followed her into the grave. Nero may have killed her body, but history killed her memory. Nero himself became the archetype of the tyrant, a byword for excess and sin. He was remembered not for his policies, his building projects, or his patronage of the arts, but for his vices: the arsonist who fiddled as Rome burned, the man who wed a castrated boy, the ruler who killed his mother and perhaps slept with her. In this, he transcended history to become a figure of mythology. Even the early Christians, suffering under his persecutions, cast him as the beast of Revelation, the Antichrist himself. No emperor before or after carried such a weight of rumour. Nero was not merely a man, he became a legend of evil, an emblem of how power corrupts to the point of inhumanity. The Julio-Claudians, taken together, formed the perfect tragic arc. Augustus began with order and morality, but his descendants spiraled into chaos and corruption. Tiberius withdrew into perversion. Caligula descended into madness. Claudius allowed his wives to shape the empire's fate, and Nero ended in disgrace. Each ruler seemed to sink deeper, and each scandal seemed to grow darker. By the dynasty's end, Rome's memory was not of empire consolidated, nor of provinces administered, but of rumours, daughters exiled for adultery, wives prostituted in disguise, sons seduced by mothers, emperors debasing themselves on stage. The dynasty became a morality tale, not a story of government, but a story of sin. Yet there is something deeper here, something almost universal. The Julio-Claudians remind us that history is not simply about what happened, but about what people believed happened. The truth of the incest between Nero and Agrippina may never be known. The existence of Messalina's brothel may have been pure invention. Caligula's marriages to his sisters may have been distorted by gossip. But once whispered, once written, once repeated, these stories became real in the only way that matters. They shaped how people thought and how history remembered. In the Empire of Rome, power was fragile, but rumour was eternal. As the empire moved on, new dynasties arose: the Flavians, the Antonines, the Severans, but the Julio-Claudians haunted them all. Every scandal of later rulers echoed the whispers of Nero. Every empress accused of excess stood in the shadow of Messalina and Agrippina. Every tyrant was compared to Caligula. Even centuries later, when medieval chroniclers embroidered Agrippina's story with tales of stallions and bestiality, they were merely continuing a tradition that began in Rome, to take a woman's ambition or a man's cruelty and turn it into a sexual grotesque. The dynasty lived on not in stone but in rumour. And so, when we speak today of the king who slept with his mother, we speak not only of Nero but of the dynasty itself, a family defined by scandal, remembered through whispers. The truth is gone, buried in the ashes of Rome's archives, but the shadows remain. They remain in every retelling, in every scandalous biography, in every clickbait headline that recalls Rome's darkest days. We do not remember the laws they passed or the roads they built. We remember the sins. In the end, perhaps that is the most Roman lesson of all. For Rome itself was built on spectacle, on theatre, on the power of appearance. An empire that staged gladiatorial games, that erected triumphal arches, that turned politics into performance. Such an empire could never forget the theatre of scandal. The Julio-Claudians were not just rulers, they were the actors in Rome's greatest tragedy, their sins performed for all eternity. And so we leave the story at the villa in AD 59, with Agrippina bleeding from the assassin's blade, crying out to strike her womb. We leave it at the villa in AD 68, with Nero pressing a dagger to his throat, lamenting the death of an artist. We leave it with whispers in marble halls, with rumours written in ink, with shadows that never fade. The emperor is dead, the dynasty is gone, but the scandal remains. The king who slept with his mother is not just a man, not just a rumour, but a memory, Rome's cruelest shadow, and perhaps history's darkest whisper.